All right, so what I wanted to talk about today is Chapter 7, Controlling Access to Files. So you could actually say files and folders. And as I mentioned in a previous video I emailed out over the weekend, everything is a file. So as far as Linux is concerned, a folder is just a file, just another type of file. We give it a different name so we can easily identify it, but the system treats them very much like they are all files. The access that we're going to be talking about, when we mean access, we're talking permissions, what you can do with those folders that you have access to. It literally says, whether you can get in there, whether you can't get in there, and when you do get in there, what exactly can you do? Can you add documents to that folder? Can you write to that file? Or can you just read it? Those are the real basic things that the Linux permissions work with. I don't know if any of you guys have been exposed to Windows permissions or taken Windows security, same kind of, this is called access control. You may hear that term in other classes. Windows, has many different permissions, many compared to Linux. How's that sound? I forget exactly how many there are, but it's at least 5 or 6 various permissions you can assign to a file or a folder, and there may be slightly more than that. With Linux, with the basic permissions, we're really only dealing with 3. And then we have these special permissions that we can use when we want to change ownership automatically of something. And we're going to talk about ownership. As a matter of fact, let's just stop right there. Let's just stop right there and go right to our little lecture here, a little meeting discussion. I don't know if I'll get through everything today because I really want to make sure that the people who are on here feel comfortable with this concept and the people who watch this video can be comfortable with this concept. So I don't rush through it. I don't fluff around with it either. I really try to make sure that what I'm telling you is what you need to know to be successful. And what you're seeing on your screen here is one of the images that we had from our last discussion when we were talking about users and groups. And this really segues right into access control. So when you combine this concept of users and groups and access control, this is where the basic security comes into the system. If you just hopped on, we're just beginning, so you haven't missed anything. But if you have a question, please go ahead and holler out. I'll answer it before we actually get into the lecture.
No questions. Thank you. Sorry, I'm a little bit late today.
That's okay. That's all right. Fully expected. Not a problem. So as I was saying, what you're seeing on your screen here is the slide from the last class where we were talking about users and groups. And as I mentioned, when you combine this concept of users and groups along with access controls, permission, and ownership, you really take your first real giant step into security and at the file system level. As an administrator, this is the kind of stuff you will do all the time, and so you really need to be comfortable with this. And so my goal is, hopefully at the end of this, you'll be comfortable with the basics. As I mentioned, I may not get through everything I want to get through because it's a big topic to explain well. It's a big topic, and I want to make sure that everybody's comfortable. So what we're going to be focused on here, and the reason I started out here, is this concept of groups and users. You take that concept and you apply it to a folder or directory, whatever you want to call it. And that's the initial step towards securing it. Basically what you're saying is only the members of sales and only this, and forget about the read-only part of it. We're gonna change that to something else here. Let me see if I can get in there. Okay, let me get out of here. There we go. We're gonna move this and we're gonna say S4. And no, I want a user Well, you could put that in there. You could put that user. Let me just get rid of these things here 1 second. I obviously did not set it up correctly. Okay. So in this scenario, what we're saying is that we have a group, sales, and then we have this user. There's always, well, I should take that back because you don't actually have to specify a user who owns it. Because think about it, if you're setting this up for the sales department, normally who would create this structure would be either the root account, somebody logged in as root, which I will be doing, or somebody who has elevated sudo privileges who can also do this. But we're going to stick with root in this one just because I think it's easier to understand, and you'll see immediately when I initially create the files and folders who the owner is. And the owner of any file and folder is, by default, the user, and the group is the person who created them. Remember that private group concept, right? So S4 over here, that S4 is a user, right, and has a user ID, and immediately after they're created, they're placed into their own private group. So when S4 creates something, let's just say, and by default S4 would only be able to create it in folders he has permission to, which is his home directory initially, unless we modify that in some way. So more likely what you'll see is, what you will see when I'm creating it, I'll be creating it as root, and everything starts out that root owns it. Both the user root owns it and the group owns it. And we have to modify that depending on who we want to give access to. In this case, we're going to be focusing in on sales and maybe some other directories or other groups on the system. And I'm going to show you how you deal with this concept of ownership. You want to take, root creates these things, and then he wants to give ownership of those things to whoever needs it, because root has a lot of things to do, and so once you're setting it up correctly, you don't have to really worry about it anymore. And you could actually have somebody, the user, change the user owner in here, and they would have the right to change permissions and things like that on here also. But we'll talk about that when we get a little bit further. So, ownership. This is the most basic concept. It's not really difficult to understand once you go through this process. Hopefully after our little discussion you'll be comfortable. So there are 3 entities on the system that can own a file or a folder. You have the user that can own it. You have the group that can own it. We haven't really touched on the others yet, and that actually is how they are described, the others. So it's everybody who's not the user, not the group, everybody else on the system is clumped into the others. And yeah, the user and the user over here, when he or she is trying to get into a folder that she does not own or she is not, she's a member of the other. So every account on here is a member of this others group. The way Microsoft defines it is they call it the everyone group. I think that's a great way to put it, actually, because it's pretty clear everyone is included in that. That's why I put the little globe there. So let me just show you what that looks like at the command line, and then we'll come back here. All right, I'm going to do an ls-l in here. I'm going to touch a file so we can just work on one thing, not seeing a lot of things here going on. Touch file 1. Do an ls-l on file 1. So ownership right now. We're going to get into permissions next, but ownership, what you're seeing on your screen is the user owner, and the user owner is always in the right position. That's why I put it there in the diagram like that. Users, group, and others. So that eWalsh, that designation, that actually is who the user that owns this. And then over here, we have the group that owns it. So by default, as I said, when you create something, that's what happens. You are the owner, user owner, and the group owner. The others you don't see on here because we'll get to them when we get into permissions, right? When we start talking about permissions, you don't actually see them here. But once you get used to it, you'll notice that that little thing I have highlighted right there, those 3 positions right there, those are the positions that apply to the others. While we're here, let's just look at it. It's actually, it's logical, right? To me, it's logical, and I think it'll be logical to you too. So the leftmost name, I might have said the rightmost name, but the leftmost name before is the user owner. And the permissions that are assigned to that account, that user account, are these first 3. Well, actually, it's the next after that little dash right there. That little dash that you see, if it's a directory, and I'll do an ls-l on here, you can see over here, there's a D at the very beginning of the line. And that is telling you that the thing you're looking at is a directory. Because you can get to the point, you can negate the color, right? So you can get rid of color, and there'll be many instances where you are administering a box and they don't have this color enabled. And as a matter of fact, color is not wholly reliable. Later on, I'll show you why I say that. But if you want to negate color, you don't want to see color, what you can do is put a backslash before that ls command. I'll clear my screen. And I'll press enter now. Now it's not so clear what I'm looking at unless I know to look over here and I see a D. If I see a D there, even though there's no color, no blue telling me, and blue is the default, right? Blue is default for directories. Every distribution that I've ever worked with keeps the same color scheme. Blue is directory. We'll just leave it there and we'll see other colors pop up as we go by. But once again, you may not have colors available to you. You may have to SSH into a remote box, and that box is basic and does not have colors enabled. You can still tell what that thing is by looking over here. That's a directory. File 1 down here, right? The name implies it's a file. And whenever you see a dash, just a blank dash at that point, you know you're dealing with some kind of file. It could be any kind of file, but it's not a directory, it's not a block file, it's not a character file, it's not a link. All those little letters will show up here. These things will change if you are looking at a link, like a symbolic link to something. It will have an L there, right? It'll have an L at that point. And block files have B's at that point. As a matter of fact, I can do that for you, Dave, SDB. Notice this is what that represents your hard drive, right? That's drive A. So I'm going to get into this when we start talking about these, but right now the S just implies it's probably serial ATA or SCSI. It's the thing you'll probably see most of the time unless they have the newer NVMe drives designation in there, then it will look different. Right now, I want you to focus on this because that's what the book talks about, and that's what the vast majority of time you will see. So in this case, this is a serial ATA or a SCSI, some kind of SSD card. That's what the S implies. The D says it's a drive or a disk. You can think of it that way. And then the A is the first letter in the alphabet, so I know looking at that I'm dealing with the first drive in the system. The first drive, as it's registered when you're booting up your box, that's drive number 1. And in the Windows world, you can think of drive C, right? The C drive as that A. It's not difficult to understand once you get kind of comfortable. Just remember, S is SCSI or whatever it is. They do have an H option, but that's very old. So sometimes you will see HDA there, but that's pretty old. You don't really see that anymore. It stood for basic hard drive, so hard drive, and then the letter came after it. And that when we were dealing with those, you were dealing with IDE type drives, which we don't really deal with anymore unless you have a really old computer. So the reason I brought... Someone had a question?
So the dev that stand for devices or is like developers? The dev directory?
Devices. It stands for devices. Good question.
Oh.
Let me just turn my volume up a little bit more. Okay. Yeah, so /dev is where you find your device files. And most of the time, and in this class, we're going to be focused on drives. This is where we find our drives and the partitions that are on those drives. I won't get into that right now. I don't want to, muddy up at things or what we're talking about. We have enough right here, right now. But what I wanted to show you with that was that is a D, which means that thing is a directory. This has a B there, and that means it's a block device. We store things on that. It's actually a file that represents your hard drive, so it goes through that file to save the data on your hard drive. That's another reason why you hear everything is a file in Linux, right? So once again, getting back to ownership here, on the left-hand side, you're always looking at the user owner of this file. And on the right-hand side, you're always looking at the group. That never changes. And you'll really see it clear when we create more directories or look at directories that are already created for different groups like the sales group, the HR group, and things like that. And the reason I was bringing this up also is that the permissions that apply to the user are these permissions here, right? Forgetting about that first dash that's right there because we know that means it's a file. That's the user permissions, right? Those are the user's permissions. And right now, the user eWalsh has read and write to that file, which is what it normally would be, right? You can read it, you can write it. The group eWalsh is also picking up read and write to that file. And this other one right here, this one at the end, that's what applies to everybody else, the others on this box. So that's what you're seeing here, right? That's exactly what you're seeing here. If I was to type out the permissions here, so permissions for the user account in this case was read write. Permissions for the group account was read write. And the permissions for the others was read, which implies read only. So those are the two entities that we will be manipulating. And as you can see, it's not that difficult, right? You don't have to remember tons of things here. When you do get into fackles and a more advanced way of looking at permissions, you can have multiple groups and multiple users all accessing that file or directory at different levels of permission. The others pretty much stay the same. As a matter of fact, you notice I have the others in red. And the reason I put the others in red is because you always want to make sure that you are not giving excessive permissions to everybody on the box. Think about it. You have the sales folder. These three entities are there. They never leave. They are always there. So if you were to make a mistake here, over here, if you were to make a mistake and setting up your permissions, you get read, write, execute to this folder, and let's say it's right at the root of the file system and they can get to it. That means anybody who has enough knowledge of Linux will now be able to get to this folder and read, write, execute, meaning they can delete things in here. That's why you really, most of the time, you're taking all the permissions away from the others, right? You literally are just saying done, 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 bing, ding, ding, right? 3 dashes. We'll put a little space there. Dash, dash, like that. So it would look something like this typically, where we have permissions for the users, permissions for the group, and then the others get nothing. Unless you are in a special situation. Let's say this folder was some kind of a public folder where you were setting it up where everybody could dump their pictures from their weekend, or maybe some funny jokes or recipes or whatever, and you want everybody in the company to have access to that thing. That's when you would apply permission to the others. There is another instance where you do that, and you're going to see that in a second, when I create a hierarchy and I want some people to get in. I want everybody to get into the top directory, and then at that point I start limiting where they can go from there. Any questions, gentlemen, about users, groups, or others? I mean, at this point, that's all I want you to know. I haven't talked about permissions yet. I haven't really changed them.
Yeah, I have a question.
Yeah.
So, like, if you were to set like the user in the group to have 0 permission, dash, then does the root user still have access to the files and the folder? Because I guess the root user can always have access.
So are you saying that both the users and the group have no permissions, all dashes, or you're saying just a user? I just want to be clear.
Just the user.
So yeah, then so if you had, let's just say, let's do it then. Let's make it the way you want it. All right, so dash, 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 like that. So in this case, the only entity that would be able to get in there would be the group, and of course root. Right? Root can do anything. So root can always get into any place. But in this scenario right here, right now, what we're saying, and really the permission isn't even set right? Because, okay, I'm not going to get into that for a second. Just leave it here. I'll talk about that because we're going to go into the permissions. But at default, right now, as it stands, the user account would have nothing. Right? So the user account has nothing. The others have nothing. And the only entity on this box that can actually view, and it's using a directory here, it should be a file. So let me just do that real quick, because directories are a little different, so I don't want to confuse things. I'm going to bring a file out here. All right, you're going to see why I did this in a second, or in a few minutes anyway. So as it stands right now, the user doesn't have ownership of this. And so they get no permissions. Even if you have their name in there, right? So it could say something like Ed in the users. But if Ed has 0 permissions to it, Ed can't do anything with that file. Any member of the group will be able to read and write to that file. And the others, in this case, will get nothing. Now, there is one thing I'm going to tell you. This might be a little premature, but since we're here, and it was a good question, it does go in order. So when the system is evaluating permissions, the first thing it does is it looks at what are the permissions to the user account. Then it looks at what are the permissions to the group account. And then finally, it looks at what are the permissions to the others. And the reason I say this, let's come up with a scenario where the user, and we're going to say it's Ed here, right? So we'll say it's Ed. Can I change that? No, I can't change that. So we'll just say this is Ed, and Ed is also a member of the group, right? So Ed is the user owner, and in this case, Ed is also a member of the group. If you were to do something like that in this scenario where Ed is here, the user owner, and Ed is part of a group, when Ed tries to access that file, he will not be able to. Why? Because the system evaluates the user permissions first. If that user is also in the group, and that user in this case gets no permissions, then he gets no permissions. Simple. End of story. So that could be a little bit funky. I don't know why you would put a user in that space and then not give them permissions. You can do other things. There is a user account, the nobody account, which literally that's what it is. It's no particular user at all. And you could put the nobody account in there as the user owner, which pretty much means nothing. Only the root account or somebody with sudo privileges would be able to administer this folder or file and change its permissions. So it always goes in that order, always, right? So it always goes user, evaluate user first, move on to group. Once you evaluate group, move on to the others. And like I said, if Ed's the user and Ed's in the group, in this scenario, the way we have it set up, because Ed is that user account is evaluated first, whatever permissions are there, it does not matter that he's in the group, because he, in this case Ed, gets those permissions, which is none. He gets no permissions at all. That's a little, just keep that in mind when you are working with these things. But once again, I can't come up with a good reason why you would put a user account in there and then give it no permissions. Like I said, you could put the nobody account in there. That's the same as basically saying there is no user. And then you can set the permissions as you want. It doesn't really matter because there is no account, nobody that can log into this box and administer it. So it's effectively negating the user ownership of this thing. Did that answer your question? Was that anything else you wanted to add to that?
So if we were to remove all the permission on the group, then like I guess like nobody can access that. Yeah,
exactly. You got it. Remove those last read writes from there, and nobody gets anything. Once again, good to play with, right? I would encourage you to do things like this. Would you set that up in the real world? Nah. There's no reason to do that. You create a file or a folder so somebody can do something with it, right? I mean, root can always do it, but even in that case, I would still make root the owner, user, and group owner, which it is by default anyway. But those are the kind of things I encourage you to play with. See what happens. Create a directory or a folder, put the user in their account, then put the user account in the group, give them no permissions to the user, give them all permissions to the group, and you will still find that everybody in that group can do it, except the user, who was also the user owner, who has no permissions at all. So
but like the root user always have access to everything. The root user,
yes,
sudo and
the root user violates all security, and that's the reason why we protect the root account with our lives, right? Not being dramatic, but let me tell you, if somebody gets your root password, you're in big trouble, because they can do anything, anywhere. Even there are ways you can slow root down, right? You can do things that will slow the root user account down, but they won't stop them. All it is a little bump in the road that I have to get over to get to what I want to do. So yeah, root can do anything. Bottom line.
Makes sense.
Yeah, no, great question. Great question. Please, as we go through this, just hop out there if you're not clear about something. All right, so that is, let's go, before we move on and look at permissions, let's just go change ownership a little bit. Let's play around with these two commands that we can use. There's the chown command for change owner, and there's the change group command. Those both are used to modify who owns what on the system. And that is something that is done by either root or somebody with root type elevated permissions, sudo permissions. All right, so let's go look at that. Let's just go mess around with ownership first. Hopefully it'll make a little bit, take it one step at a time. All right, I'm not going to mess with stuff in my place. You know, it's okay, but I think it's a little more realistic to go around and create like a sales group, a sales folder, and then play with that and see how we can change it. So I'm going to switch over to root so I don't have to think about anything and don't add sudo. And I'm going to do an ls-l. I think I have it here. No, I did. Okay, so I deleted it. Okay, got that recursive one. I thought I had one in here. Oh, I do. Okay. All right, we're not gonna go there just yet. We're going to come to that in a few moments. What I'm about to do is not what I recommend that you do. So you know slash is the beginning of the file system. And I wouldn't recommend that you create a sales folder for the sales group right on the root of the file system. I think it's a better idea to create something called like departments, and then underneath departments you have the various folders that identify these groups. In this case, I created the departments folder right at the root of the file system, because they all have to have access, right? They all have to have access. Everybody needs access to the root of the file system. As a matter of fact, let's get out of here for a second. And I'll just do an ls-l on the root of the file system. And if you look at this, and you still follow me what we were talking about before, you'll notice that root is the user owner and the group owner of everything at the root of the file system. And the permissions that are being applied are read and execute to the group, read and execute to the user, or user and group. I have the group highlighted right now. And then over here, remember, that's everybody else. So at the root of the file system, and this is a requirement, because you wouldn't be able to move around the file system if it wasn't like this, everybody has the ability to read and execute. Meaning, read and execute on a directory means that you can open that directory and go into it and even view its contents of that directory. Now that may seem a little overboard right now, but like I said, that's required. That's required in whatever directory you create. If you don't want the others to be able to get into it, anybody else in the system, you have to modify that part of it. And you should modify that part of it. We're going to come back to that in a second. First, I'm going to just kind of play around with sales here. Let me just make sure I didn't do it already. Did I do it? No. Okay. All right. So just so it keeps it clean for right now. I don't want to jumble it up. So we're going to keep it clean, and we're going to make a directory /sales. Once again, this is not what I would do. It's not what I recommend that you do. It would just clutter up the root of your file system. That's the reason for it, right? It has nothing to do with it violates anything. It's perfectly fine to do this, but what you'll end up with is this, you know, if you have sales, HR, admins, payroll, I mean, go on and on and on and on with all these different various groups depending on the size of the company you're dealing with. All of a sudden your root file system is just going to get filled up, and it's going to be harder to look and read. So just like, you know, working with a file cabinet, you know, you open the drawer, you create a folder, and then you put things in the folder, and if you need a subfolder in there, you put another folder in there, right? So you keep it where it's easy to navigate. But for right now, we're going to look at this. So I am logged in as root. Right? I'm logged in as root, and I am creating the sales directory at the root of the file system. I'll press enter, and the first thing I'll do is do an ls-ld, right? I want to see the permissions that were assigned by default now. By default, this is how it is every time. Press enter, and what we see, it's the sales folder. Root is the user owner. Root is the group owner. Everybody else in the company can get into that folder right now based on those permissions. So what we would want to do, we're going to get into permissions in a second, and you'll see why that is the case and what you do to make sure that everybody else doesn't get in there, right? Because really the only people who should be able to get into a directory, a department directory, or any kind of secure directory that you create should only be the entities that you want to be able to get in there. And more than likely, it's going to be the user account and the group, right? The others, like I said, is you know, if you have some, you know, trash can that everybody can dump stuff into, then you'll see it. So what I want to do, the first thing I want to do, and I have to make sure that I actually, hold on a second, let me do this. No, I'll do this. Okay, I do have a sales, okay. I do have a sales group, good. So I created the sales group, oops, come back here. And the first thing I want to do is change the group ownership of this. Remember, this is a sales folder. I want it to be owned by the sales group. And the command that you can use to do that is the change group command. So what I'm going to do is say change group. The group has to be on the system, right? If the group is not on the system, you have not created the group ahead of time, then I would have to create the group at this moment, because it isn't going to work if the group doesn't exist. And then sales. Clear my screen, press enter. I'll do another ls-d on sales. Now you can see that sales is the group owner of this. Root's still there too, and you know what? There's nothing wrong with leaving it there, because like we said, root can do anything root wants to do. So that's perfectly fine. You know, you don't have to worry about permissions or anything if the root owner. Now I would change the user owner. Let's say, you know, we're all in the sales department and we have this one user who actually is the admin for the sales department. Let's say the name is Jane. And so what I would do in that case is I would give Jane the user ownership of that and sales the group ownership of that. And that way, if something should happen and they need to change permissions for some odd reason, they can. Actually, Jane would be able to do that. User owners, when you give user ownership to a directory, and that sales is a good example of this, the person you make user owner, you want to trust them, meaning that you're giving them some special access to that directory. And what they can do is change permissions. They can modify the permissions. So you just don't give that to anybody. And if you don't have anybody you can give it to, then you just leave it at root, or you can make it the nobody account. So I'm going to do that. I'll make it the nobody account. So I've changed the group ownership to sales. And now, for the heck of it, I want to set it to the nobody account as the user owner, which basically is negating the user owner in all intents and purposes. There is no user owner. Only root can manipulate that thing at that point. And the command you use is the chown command. Change ownership. In Linux we pronounce it chown. And what I would do is I would say nobody. Nobody/sales. And you know what? I'm just going to make sure that because what it might do, chown is kind of interesting. Change group does exactly what you think it does. Change group, just change the group ownership. That's it. Chown can do both. Chown can do the user and the group. And how you would, you know, tell it that you want to do that is you would put a colon, right? So it's always on the left is always the user. On the right is always the group. Never changes, perfectly solid every time. So what I could do is something like that. Sales on/sales. What that would do, if sales wasn't the owner of it, then it would modify both the user owner and the group ownership in one swat. But what happens if you don't put that colon there, and I'm going to try it, I'm going to see what happens here. It very well may change both automatically for us. So let's see what it did. Nah, it didn't. Good. Excellent. So in that case, it did exactly what I wanted it to do, right? It just changed the user owner to the nobody user. Once again, it means nobody owns it. Exactly. I could, like I said before, let me get back there. I could, if I want to change both, then, I could do, if there's a sales team, right, group, I could give the sales team ownership of this group, ownership of it. So there are only two commands you have to think of when you think of ownership. You think of chown, and chown could be the only command you think of, honestly. Because you could do something like this. Remember that colon? That colon, so nobody, colon, sales, team. That's what we were doing, right? So we could do that. That colon separates them. That tells the system the left is the user, the right is the group. But you know what? If you left the colon there and removed the username but left the colon there, you're telling the system you want to change the group only because the the left side is blank. Sorry, I got a Tic Tac in my mouth here. But there are only two commands. Change group, change owner. And if it's easy, just remember, change group changes the group, change owner changes the owner. That's, if you remember that, you're perfectly fine. You don't have to get fancy with it, right? But you can if you want to and change both. So as it stands right now, our sales folder, we've changed the ownership of the sales folder. Nobody is the user that owns it. These permissions, even though they're there, they don't apply to anybody. Right now, what we have is read and execute for the sales group, and then we have read and execute for everybody else. And this is at this point, that's the thing you want to eliminate. Obviously, we don't want anybody as the user owner, and we only want people who are members who we purposely put into the sales group to be able to access this folder. So what we would want to do is eliminate, right, that. And I'm going to show you how to do that in a second, but I don't want to get into it. Any questions about chown or change group or ownership? It really is basic. Don't overthink it and you'll be perfectly fine, right? But if you do have any questions, please, even anything is weird, go ahead and holler out. This is the time to do it. Okay. So let's go back to our little board here. So here we are, right? That's ownership, right? And there's only two commands that we have to remember when we're dealing with ownership. You got the change group. Oops, didn't mean to do that. Come here. Change group. That's one. And then change owner or chown, to chown it. That's the only two that you have to remember when it comes to modifying ownership. Because the others, we handle the others with permissions. We do this to the others most of the time. When you want to negate anybody else who isn't a member of the sales group to get into this folder, you just -- remove all permissions from the others position, and then nobody else can get in but members of the group, which in this case is sales. All right. So what we're going to do now is move on to basic permissions. I'm going to put this all together for you, right? I'm going to put it all together for you at the end and combine these pieces together. But we have to take them in chunks. Hopefully it'll be a little bit easier. Let me move these over here. So these are the basic permissions, right? These are the basic permissions. There's read, there's write, and there's execute. There are special permissions. If we can get to that, if we're doing okay, we'll move on to that also. Now there are two different, we're going to call them objects here. They both are technically called files. You'll see that in literature and people say that in groups. For right now, it's a file and it's a directory, right? Or a folder, whichever way you want to describe it. And those three permissions do act differently depending on, is it a file or is it a directory? So let's talk about what the difference is, because it is important that you know that. So read on a file does exactly what you expect it to do. Nothing. As a matter of fact, all the file, well, except for maybe execute, because you really don't know what execute is doing, but read and write when it comes to files or do exactly what you think they do. Read allows you to read the contents of that file. Write allows you to modify that file. Now you would need read and write to be able to see what the heck you're doing, right? Because if you can't read it, you're going to be in the dark about modifying it. You could still do things like redirect stuff into it and things like that. But you can't actually read the document without that. So read is important, even when you're putting write there. Because write just means they can modify the contents of that file. Delete, add, whatever they want to do. Execute on a file. What execute implies on the file is that there's some kind of code, some executable code, best way of saying it, in there that needs to be executed. Whether it's an application that needs to run. If you have an application that needs to run and it doesn't have execute, it's not going to run. If you have a script that you've created and you want that script to be able to run by default without doing anything fancy, you have to apply execute to it. So most of the time, execute is not going to be applied to a file, right? If you just create a text file, you do not need execute on a file. Documents, spreadsheets, when I say text file, I mean fill in the blank. It could be any number of text files. You do not need it, and it's not prudent to put execute on something that does not need to be executed. Not that it will affect anything, but technically somebody could come in who has the right to modify that file, but they don't, and then they put in some code that does something malicious, like a little script that does something malicious in there, and they could execute it. But if they don't have execute on it, it's nothing. It's just a bunch of writing in the file. It won't do anything. So I'll leave that there. I just wanted to point that out, that on most files, when they are created, you do not see the execute permission on them. Only, and you have to apply them, right? You have to apply execute. You have to say this thing is executable. And that's only if it's a script or a program that you're trying to run. On a directory, let me get a directory out here so we can kind of separate that. On a directory, the read permission, it's still reading, but what it's reading is the contents of the directory. As a matter of fact, Microsoft's permission for read, they don't use read, they use list. And that's a great way to describe the function of read when it's on a directory. You can list the contents of the directory, right? You can't open the folder just yet. I got to give you another permission for you to do that. But if you had this other permission, if you had the ability to get into that, you could do an ls. When I say read, I'm talking about listing. So ls-l, you see me do it all the time in a directory. That's how I'm able to do it. There is the read permission on the directory. The write permission on a directory now, so we're sticking with directories. The write permission is probably the most dangerous permission you can place on a directory because what that allows people to do, or remove the contents of that directory. Maybe that's a better way of saying it. Don't remove the contents of the directory. So if you apply write to a directory, the users who are the owners of that. And if you give right to the others, everybody else on the system, you're creating a disaster for yourself. So right allows you to remove the contents of the directory. And here's the most important part about that. Right on a directory allows the person with that right permission to delete anything in there, even if they don't own it. So let's say root was to put a file in this directory, and by accident I applied right to that directory to the others, everybody. Anybody on the system who has an account could then go into that directory and they could delete the file that is created by root, even if they don't own it, even if they don't have permissions to it. That's scary. So removing or giving somebody the right permissions allows them to remove the contents of that directory. Execute on a directory. So execute on a directory. I think of execute on a directory as a key, and I'm going to use this little file cabinet over here to explain that analogy. If you don't have execute, so think of the file system as a filing cabinet, right? The filing cabinet, the actual case itself is the root of the cabinet, and each of those drawers are directories underneath or included in the filing cabinet itself. If you don't give someone the execute permission on a directory, basically what happens is those directories are locked to them. Because as I said, execute on a directory is like the key. If I give you execute to the directory, then you can open that directory. So once you have execute, you can now have the key and you can open it. If you give someone, you might be thinking, oh, I can just give somebody the execute permission to the directory and they'll be able to get in it. No, they also need the read permission. They need two permissions to actually see the contents. Because remember, read, what does read do on a directory? Let's get rid of this. It lists the contents of the directory. That's what it does. So if you were to give somebody execute but not give them read to a directory, it would be like me telling you there's a filing cabinet in this room and here's the key. Go, you can open it and get me some files out of there. But let's say I didn't give them read. It would be like you going into a pitch black room with no lights whatsoever, completely dark, and you have a key to the directory, right? You have a key to the filing cabinet. You can open it. Maybe you could figure out, stumble around there, get the key and open it. You wouldn't be able to see anything. In other words, execute on a directory without the read permission is basically like you're blind. You can't see anything in there. So those two permissions, read and execute, must be given on a directory if you want users to be able to actually get into that directory, to be able to traverse it. And that's why when we go back to our system over here, and once again, I'm going to do an ls-l on the root of the file system. -l. That is why the others have those two permissions. It's a requirement that everybody be able to traverse the top of the file system. Everybody. You'll notice only root's the group owner and only root's the user owner. So how the heck, as E. Walsh in this box, and I'll exit out so you can see that, how does E. Walsh be able to view the top of the file system and go into boot, right? How can I go into boot? Because, boot, not boot. How can I get in there? PWD? Because I have read and execute. Not directly. I'm not the user owner and I'm not the group owner, but I am part of the everyone group or the everyone entity, right? So in the others, it's called the others in Linux. Because we call it the others, I guess, because we use an O to identify that when we're actually setting permissions. So I can view it, I can go into any of these directories on top, and that's okay, because if we don't want that to happen, we can modify those permissions. But everybody by default can traverse the file system. And the reason they can, even though there's no ownership but root, they can do it because they pick up read and execute. Remember, read is list, execute is the key to open the directory, and you need both of them. So if I do an ls in the boot directory, I can see the contents of that directory. And I can see the contents of that directory because I was able to get into it with execute, and then I was able to list it with the read command. Does that make sense, gentlemen? Any questions about that? Okay. The more you play with this, set it up yourself, the better you will get with it. This is an absolute, theory is wonderful. Having a good book, a good video, a good lecture, all great. But they mean nothing if you don't actually go in there and play with these. And I mean literally, screw it up. Screw up the permissions, right? Change them. First write them down, what they were, especially in the beginning. Write them down what they were, or take a screenshot or something. And then go ahead and play around with them. See what happens, right? So if I wanted to, and I'll do this right now just so you can see. So right now, eWalsh is able to get into boot, right? So I'm going to exit. Now cd. And I'm going to su. Sudo su dash. And as root, I'm actually going to change the permissions so that you can see what happens when a normal account like eWalsh doesn't have read and execute to a directory. So the command that we can use to do that is the chmod command, or change mode, chmod. There's 1,000 different ways to pronounce this one. But change mode is probably the most common one that you'll see. And if you use that term, you're safe. I for a long time I would say you're going to chmod the directory, because actually the first guy I took a Linux class from who was good, I took a Linux class from this one guy, and the college sent me there. They spent a ton of money, and the guy was terrible, man. He was just horrible. He was actually surfing the web most of the time. He would give us the book and tell us to read and go do an exercise. He was terrible, that guy. So I don't remember anything about what that guy said because the class was crap. But then I went to another training site. Actually, they're up in Bountiful, Guru Labs. If you ever need Linux training when you're out in industry, Guru Labs, if you want to go on site to do it. They actually do remote training too. I actually have taught for them. I took their classes years ago, became an RHCE, and sometime years later, the guy remembered, hey, he's an RHCE. We needed somebody to teach a class. So I taught for them for quite a few years, actually. Excellent instructors, top-notch. They know a hell of a lot more than I know. So the guy who originally I took the class from at Guru Labs pronounced that chmod. And so for the longest time, that's what I would say. Chmod this thing. But it's not a common way to pronounce that command. So change mode's the way to go. And what I can do, once again, we're going to be talking about permissions in a second, but I just want to show you the power of this right now. So what I can do is I can remove permissions just from one of the entities, user, group, others. And if I want to, in this case, I want to remove the permissions from the others on the boot directory, just so you can see that I won't be able to get back into it now. And how we do that, there's actually a couple of different ways we do that. I'm going to explain both ways to you. but there is a numeric way of doing it, and then you could use letters. So numbers or letters. You can use either of those to reference the permissions that you want to assign. I would encourage you in the beginning, get used to using the letters because it really allows you to get really pinpoint on what you want to do. So how do we define others? Remember I told you it's an O, not a 0, it's an O, the letter O. And if you want to add permissions, you would use a plus. If you want to subtract permissions, you would use a dash, right? A minus sign. So in this case, I want to remove read and execute. You don't have to specify all of them. Remember, because when you actually look at the permissions, they look like this. There's an underscore and then there's an execute. You don't have to specify that when you're defining the permissions. So I know there's only read and execute assigned to that others group for this directory. So I can just say O minus RX against boot. Now, there's no reason to do this except as an instructor to demonstrate it, or if you want to practice. Honestly, what I would recommend you do is just go ahead and create another directory, and then you can do things like this. Because by default, if you create something as root, the others are immediately going to get read and execute. I'll show you a way to get around that. There is a way to get around that default permissions going to the others, and you probably want to implement this unless the company you work for is against it, right? You can change this thing called a UMask that will, when you create a directory, not give permissions to the others, which most of the time you do not want to give permissions to the others. The default file system requires it, but after that, almost, unless you're creating some hierarchy and you need them to get into the top one, which I do have, and I will show you that. But you don't need any department directories you're creating. The others shouldn't be able to get anywhere near that thing. They should be able maybe to see it's there, but that's it. All right, so I've changed the permissions. Let's go look at the permissions on the boot directory. So here they are. Normally there is a read and execute right there. There's nothing. So now I'm going to exit out as I'm back as Ed here, and I'm going to try to CD back into the boot directory. Permission denied. Why am I being denied? I'm being denied because that directory, the only way I can get into that directory is through the others, because it's root all the way through. Root has the permissions that he needs to get in there, or she needs to get in there, but everybody else on this system now cannot get into that folder. Not necessarily a bad thing on, more. Let's say when you're on a production box, there are lots of ways you can force users not to be able to view, right, the whole root of the file system. They could do it if it's a Linux desktop they're using, yes, or a Mac, yes, but on a server, they're not going to be able to just bounce around easily, or you can prevent that from happening anyway. So, okay, so that stops me now. I can no longer get into boot, permission denied. I now want to add those permissions back. So how we do it is chmod command again. We do the O plus and R and X. Once again, you don't have to put the underscore there or the dash there. It's actually a dash, I should say that. It wouldn't hurt it if you do, but you don't have to. But let's see what happens if I do. Oh, right, I can't do this. Why can't I do this? Because I'm logged in as eWalsh. And unless I use my sudo privileges to do that, it's not going to happen. So I could preface that command with sudo. Oops, Control A. Another one. In this case, I don't think I'll have it in. Nah, I don't. Okay, so let's go ahead and we'll sudo to root and be able to do this. So ls-ld, I want to see the permit. The D is important when you're doing ls, right? If you do ls-l on boot, what you're going to see are the contents of boot, not the directory itself. So there's everything in the directory. I want to see the permissions on the directory that contains all those things. In that case, you have to put the D. That's how you can see it. There's another way to do it, but it's a little more confusing for new people anyway. So I do that. Sure enough, there's the permissions for the others. I want them to be correct the way they should be. And so I will chmod it. I will do O plus write and execute. Boot. Now I'll exit out again. I'll do an ls-ld as eWalsh. Sure enough, can I CD into that thing? Yeah. pwd, where am I? I'm in boot. So that is a good example of just how important permissions are, right? They will prevent you from being able to do things if you want to. So once again, I was demonstrating that so you could see the power of read and execute when it comes to a directory, right? So to execute on a directory allows you to open that directory, right? That's what it does. Think of the key in the filing cabinet, right? But you also have to have the lights on in the room. That's we could say read is the lights. So you need the lights on in the room that you're in, and you need the key to the filing cabinet. At that point, you open it up and you can read the contents of it. That's what read and execute do for us in the file system. Questions? Anybody have questions about that? Any questions?
I have a question for you.
Yeah, cool.
So, you know how you did like change mode and then you did O? Could you specify a user and then do the plus sign read,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. So those three entities, users, groups, and others.
Yeah, you were just referring to others in
That's
that.
right, exactly.
So if I wanted to give, say, operator 1 the permissions, I could do the same thing. Operator, I could do change mode and then do the...
So you would use use for user, G for group, and then O for others. So
Okay.
let's go take a look at it. That's a good question. So I think it'll be a little bit clearer if we get there and look at it.
So like if we were to change like the group permissions, we would use G.
Yeah, exactly.
And then we would use the other one, the change group, to give them access to whatever files.
Well, so remember, Caden, change group changes the ownership of that thing. So
Right.
So even if they own it, if they don't have permissions to get in there, they're not going to be able to do it.
Right. And this is how we would do that. We would just use G instead of... Okay.
Yeah. So it's for users, you would do, I'm going to do a chmod. So if I wanted to change permissions on the users, I would do U, and then I would either add or subtract, right? So plus or minus, either way, same thing. And then I would put the permissions I want there. So user, read, write, execute, right? Get rid of it for boot. That would remove the user permissions for that. Right? Once again, you don't do that to boot, right? Just I'm using this just because...
Right, just as an example.
Yeah, exactly.
But this would apply for any file or any directory or...
Exactly. It's the same thing you do. As a matter of fact, you could specify all of them. You could say UGO minus read, write, execute. So literally, UGO, user, group, others, you're literally taking all permissions away from everybody. Kind of nonsensical, right? Doesn't really make any sense.
And again, that wouldn't be a practical use of it. But just as an example, like if we wanted to give a group and users permissions to read and execute, instead of typing out U and then doing it, we could just put them together, combine them, and do it, right?
Right. You could change just the user in the group. More than time when you're doing something like this, you're going to be doing a plus, right? I want to give the users and the group, which, actually, that's a good permission to set for a user and a group. Once again, if the user is the nobody group, the permissions don't matter. The nobody user, the permissions don't matter anyway. But that would change the permissions for the users and the user and the group to read, write, and execute on the boot directory.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
There's lots of fun things you can do with this command, and I am going to show it to you. I just want to talk about the numeric way, using numbers to represent these things before I actually move on and really start playing around with the chmod command and playing with it.
And then again, if we ever get confused, we can just do change mode and then do tab and see what our options are. Or we could do manual, right?
You know, the tab, let's see what will happen. So I'll tab out. See, some commands, they have something called bash shell completion. It's an application that's built into most modern Linux operating systems. And it's fantastic. I absolutely love it because it will try to actually add the options to it.
Right.
But some commands like chmod, it's up to you. You have to tell it, am I going to use the numbers? Am I going to use the letters? And so it's waiting for you to make a decision. So in this case, it won't complete it for you.
Okay.
If I was to do something like this, u plus read, write, execute /b, see that it will complete the directory,
but
it's not gonna complete the permissions for you. So it'll tell you, hey, which one do you want to put this on, bin or boot? That it'll do. But it is very nice. And when we get into these more advanced commands like SE Linux and LVMs and things like that, you'll see exactly what I'm talking about, where you'll tab it out, you'll hit, and it'll actually start telling you, these are the options, which one do you want? These are the options, which one do you want? Because you'll see with those that you have lots of various options you can apply.
And then if we do get lost, we can type in man, right, and see manual.
Yeah, this man, you know, sometimes it's not that easy. This is an old command, so sometimes these can be a little difficult to read. But once you get used to looking at the man page, this synopsis up at the top, so that's the command.
Yep.
What options do I want to pass to it? So the option could be like recursive. I want to do this for all the files in this directory and all the subdirectories. I'll demonstrate that for you. So that's an option that you can pass, so that you're not just doing one file or one directory, you're doing all of them. So R for recursive. And then it shows you can do the modes, right? When you think mode, right, change mod, they're talking about that mode. And it's saying to you here, and I'm going to show you this in a second, you can have one group of, you could have the user gets read write, comma, and the group gets read execute, comma, and then you can do that with the letters, and then you can apply it to any file or number of files that you want to.
Okay.
So let me just see if they do have any examples in here. Really, the one you'll use in as far as options go, they do kind of give you something right here. That it's a little cryptic, but it's something. The older man pages they can be challenging.
But I mean, and then worse comes to worse if we can't figure it out here. I mean, we've got Google, right? We can.
Google. Like I said before, I really encourage you that Stack Exchange, Stack Server, I think it is, or something like that. Those are where admins go. And so if you ever do a Google, and you see that show up, go in there and take a look at it. More than likely, you'll see, like 5 different ways to do the same things from these really top-level people. Right.
Okay, cool. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Good question. Okay. So yes, the man pages are good. You could just, -- help, right? That's also going to give you the real basic commands. It gives you the synopsis up here too. So you don't even have to go into the you even get the ugly thing down here, that thing, right? Yeah, that's funny. All right, so let's go back for a second. We're going to come back to chmodding. We're not giving up on chmodding yet. So this part is critical that you understand this, right? Because as I mentioned to you, the dangers in these two, the files and the directories, danger as far as files is concerned is just random nilly-willy adding execute to everything. Don't do that. It doesn't serve a function for a text file of any kind, a document of any kind. But technically, once you flag that thing execute and somebody has the ability to modify that document, you know what? They could go in there, create a little script, and because it's executable, it's going to run. So if it doesn't need to run, it's not an application or a script, don't put execute on it. Done. End of story. Write on a directory. So execute on a file, and it's not as bad as write on a directory. Write on a directory is a red flag to me. Unless the people who have that permission are supposed to have that permission, you remove it from everybody else, so the others. Because, like I said, that permission allows them to remove, delete, the contents of that directory. And it's a dangerous, dangerous permission. Especially, the key with this is write to the others. You will literally have to do that. You will have to add that permission to the others. You or maybe some subordinate of yours. And if they make a mistake and they add excessive permissions, they've just given the ability of some person who either doesn't know what they're doing and makes a mistake, or a malicious person. All of a sudden you say, well, we don't need you, we're laying you off, John. If John knows he's got that permission, there's a chance, right? People do crazy things. You go in there and delete everything in there. Now, if you got backups, fantastic. But literally, that permission given to the wrong person would allow them to delete the contents of a folder, no matter who owned it, no matter what permissions. Once write is given to a folder, they can delete, remove anything in that folder, regardless of who owns it, regardless of the permissions set on it. Because it actually makes sense, right? If you give the ability of somebody to add and remove documents from that thing, then you're not going to limit them based on who owns it or who's. If they don't want it in there, they shouldn't put it in there, right? They shouldn't put anything in there that they don't want somebody else to be able to delete. And there is a way to get around that. That falls under the special permissions. I don't know if we're going to get there, but I actually have a video on special permissions. If we don't get there, then I'll post that video and you guys could go check it out. You need to know your special permissions. Everything I'm telling you right here is a must. I mentioned last time we were together that, users and groups, they're going to hit you all over the place with that thing. Well, users and groups and permission and ownership, they're all together, right? They all work together. And so to pass that exam or to be really comfortable on an interview talking about something like this, you just need to understand these things. And the more you work with, the more you do it, the better you get. I actually have flashcards. Where's my flashcards? So on this topic, when it comes to permissions, on this topic I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 separate sets of flashcards, all dealing with the various aspects. I don't clump them all together because if I did, it would be, lots and lots of flash questions and answers. But especially, like once you get past these top ones, permissions 2, I go a little deeper, users and groups, special permissions are in here. Evaluating effective permissions. This is one that you want to go through. If you go through this and you can answer these questions without looking at the answer, then permissions. You're comfortable with it because it goes all back to that thing I said originally where the user comes first, group comes second, others come last. Well, these kind of questions are going to test you on that. They're going to ask you, what permissions does C. Walsh have? And you have to look, well, is he a member of a group? Is he in any of these groups? And you'll have to go back and forth looking what groups he's a member of and what permissions he has as the user owner, to answer these questions. So in this one, let's just look at it, right? So what is P. Jones's effective permission on Rifle 2? So what I would have to do, first thing I look is, where is P. Jones in the ownership? So P Jones, oh, P Jones, this is actually good here. Hold on a second. Let me see if I can get my control 2 here. Okay, good. No, I don't want you to do that. I don't know why it's doing that, but so if you look at the bottom down here, you can see that P Jones is the user owner for Rifle 1 and Rifle 2, those 2 files. She is the user owner. Now, P Jones is also a member of sales. So if you look down here, let's look at the Rifle 2 one. That's a perfect one to look at. So P Jones is the user owner. Let me see if I can make this a little bit bigger. Hold on one second. There you go. So P Jones down here is the user owner, and P Jones is a member of sales. So now you come over here and you look at what are the permissions being applied to these 2 entities. Remember, P Jones is in both, right? P Jones is part of this both. We look at the user permissions over here and we see the user owner. Let me go back. The user owner is getting read and write. So that's going to here. The sales group, on the other hand, gets only read. So the sales group is getting only read. So knowing what you know, what would be P Jones's access to that file? Who wants that one? Anybody?
He can read and write that file.
He can read it. He or she can read and write that file. Exactly. Exactly. So it does not matter the permissions assigned to the group because the system evaluates it by the user first, checks all the permissions on the user, whatever they are, they're applied. Then it moves to the group. Even if the group has no permissions to this thing, and P Jones is a member of sales, P Jones still gets read and write because those permissions were applied to the user. Right? So it always goes in that order. And there are a couple of little tricky ones in here where it's not as clear as that, right? You really have to think about what groups are they a member of. I mean, they could possibly pick it up through the others too. So if we go back here, some of these questions could be a little tricky in the sense that you're looking for a particular user and, you see their permissions, they don't get it, they get reading this, they get read, but they technically could pick it up through the others also, right? So just keep that in mind, but that's being tricky. That's being tricky. So most of the time what I want you to focus on is what are the permissions of the user? Is that user a member of the group? Oh, it is. What's the permissions to the group? You will be able to tell what permissions they get based on just that information alone. And in this case, P Jones gets read-write because the user, P Jones, owns it, and they have read-write. The sales group, which P Jones is a member of, only gets read. That doesn't matter. It's never even evaluated for P Jones. That's the key thing. The user permissions are evaluated. P Jones gets that. Everybody else in sales, except P Jones, gets read only to that file. So if you want, if you're really thinking about going for the exam, and I do encourage you to go for the exam, really do, I would suggest go ahead and take a look at those permissions. When it comes to these type of things, most of those questions are going to be something like, you want this user to have read-write access, what's the command? Right? And then you have to type it out. And you can, in Quizlet's pretty cool, you can actually have it force you to type the command. So instead of picking it out from a multiple choice, or anything like that, drag and drops, you could actually tell Quizlet, I need to type the command out. And when you get to that point, you really are at a different level, for sure. You're at a different level. Great question. I think my thing is dying. It did. All right, let me bring it back again. Bring up my board. Oops. Gotta open it. So here we're back at the basic permissions again. And remember, I had mentioned to you, I'll change the color, that read is, well, I don't know if I did say this to you. Well, you've actually seen me do this. So the read permission is abbreviated with the letter R. The write permission is abbreviated with the letter W, right? Makes sense. Write is W. And then execute is X. So, and that's the same whether it's a file or a folder. They just act differently, right? That's all that happens. They act differently if it's a file or if it's a folder. So execute down here, that's an E. And that's X. Now, it's interesting. Yeah, I'm not going to get into it. I'll leave that for another time. I don't want to clutter up things. I know this is a lot right in the beginning. Now, you can use the letters, right? So you've seen me do that. I can type a command like chmod O plus read, write, and execute, right? That's going to give the others read, write, and execute, right? Just an example of the command, how I can use them. So it's going to give them read, write, and execute. And it's kind of interesting. Let me just make this a little bit bigger. Let's say you want to give different permissions to the different entities. You can do that. You can do that. You could say something like you, and in this case, I would put them in that order. And I've never tried to put them in not in the order where user, group, and others. Probably has to go that way, but I doubt it would work if you mix them up. Is basically what I'm saying. So go with user, group, and others. So I could say user gets read and write, comma. Group gets read, write, execute, comma. O gets nothing. And actually, if you put an equal sign there and nothing after it, you're basically saying others equals nothing. Right? Or if you want to and you really want to be clear about what you're doing, you would put a minus there and read, write, and execute. And then the name of whatever you want that to apply to. So as long as you're separating them by commas, you can do that. Now, actually, there's an easier way to do that, because that's pretty long, a little cryptic to read when you're not used to looking at it. So, but you can do this, and it's very common to do this. As a matter of fact, I'm going to demonstrate how you do this with numbers, quickly to do it with numbers. It may seem a little odd at first and take a little bit to grab onto it, but you'll pick it up pretty quickly. Because this is actually more difficult in my mind for a new user to pick up than it would be for the numbers once I explain exactly how you use those. All right, so let's get rid of that. All right, so you can do things like this. So a command you can use, go over here, would be something like chmod and then 760. That, believe it or not, is going to set the permissions on everybody. And so what you need to know is how to decipher the 760. And you know what? It's not that difficult. Don't overthink it. I'm going to try to explain it to you here right now. How my mind looks at it anyway, right? So the number that's associated with the read command. So instead of R, you can use the number 4 to represent read. Now, that's easy to remember. You know how it's easy to remember? Because there's 4 letters in the word read, right? So we can say, let me get a different color up here, read equals R, or it's a 4, because that's what, sorry, got to put it in there, 4, number 4. Remember, 4 letters in the word, the number that's associated with it is 4. Right? Easy, easy. The write command is the number 2. And how I remember that is, what's the first letter in write? A W. So when I think of this, I focus on that first part, right? W. I think double, which brings me, how my brain works anyway, which brings me to 2, right? So, right, that's how I look at it, double. And execute is a 1. So I always think, X marks the plot, like a pirate map. You see the flagpole where the treasure is buried. That flagpole, in my mind, is a 1. That's how I look at it. So you have 4 for read, 2 W, 2 for write, execute is a 1. And all of these together equal 7. And you're going to see why that's significant in a second. Whoops. All of them together equal the number 7. So let's go back and look at that command again that I typed just a second ago. So chmod, I keep hitting the wrong thing. Chmod, and what I'm going to do is I'll do something a little bit different here. I'm going to go 0, 7, 0. Now you have to remember the positions, right, of the user, group, owners. User owner, group owner, others. 3 different entities. Well, you could look at each of these as representing each of those entities. This one right here, that's the user position. It has a 0 there. So what do you think that means? If there's a 0 in the user's position, what permissions is the user going to get? It's exactly what you think.
None.
None. Exactly. 0 means none. So what we're looking at here is chmod, 0 to the users, 0 to the others. They're not getting anything either. The group, what is the group getting? The group's getting
All permissions.
All permissions. Exactly. Right? That's it. Now here's the only downside of using the numbers is you never use them just individually, right? It's always you have to specify the user, the group, and the others, because that number 7 implies read, write, execute. So I could do something like this. I could say user gets 4, 7, 0, right? So 4 is applied to the user. What is 4?
It's read.
It's read. Exactly. It's amazing once you just let it go for a second. It's not that complicated. It's actually the easier way to set permissions initially on a directory. So if I create the sales directory, I can just smod it with something like that, set all the numbers the way I want, boom, 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 boom. I don't have to do the whole, read, write, dash, comma, dot, blah, blah, like that. So in this case, once again, the user account, whoever the owner is going to get a 4, which means they can read, which honestly is a worthless permission by itself, right? On a file, it's perfectly fine. On a directory, you need execute on a directory. But on a file, if they can get into the directory that the file is contained in, the read permission will allow them to read it, just R by itself. So technically, we'll say this is on files. So the user, whoever that is getting a 4. Why would you do that? I don't know. It doesn't make any sense to me. But it's possible. It's possible in certain situations. The group, on the other hand, get out of there. The group, on the other hand, will get read, write, and execute. Right? They get everything to these files in here. Or if it's a folder, they get all permissions to the folder. And the others get nothing. Most of the time, when you first create a file, what permissions they get by the system. So all files start out with default permissions. And on files, the default set by the system. This is not you. This is just how the system would do it. The system would say all files get 666, right? Read and write to that file. Remember, files don't get execute, right? So even the system by default will not put execute. If you want execute on the file, you got to apply that execute to the file. On a directory, remember, what's the permission on a directory that's really dangerous? Write. So what we want to do is remove the write permission. So on a directory, what you would see, I'll just call it a folder. Folders get, by default, they get permissions 555, right? That means they get read and they get execute, exactly what they need to open it up. When you look at the root of the directory structure, you see, what you're seeing there is 555 basically for everybody, so they can get in, read the contents of it, and that's all they can do. But so you do that. That's the way it comes by the system. And what you want to do is modify those permissions to secure your folder. So let me just go take you back to the terminal, and we're going to do that. And then we'll probably end at this point. I do have more things I want to talk about, special permissions and UMask, but I will send out a video on that so you can have a little more time to digest, as opposed to me shotgunning it to you right now. But that's it. Caden, I think it was you saying that. Caden, that's it, Caden. You got it. It's not overcomplicated.
No, I think you cleared it. It can be, I think it's a little more confusing when you're trying to read it through the text. Cause yeah. But just explaining it's pretty easy.
Okay, good. Yeah, I agree with you. This type of stuff gets lost in translation when you're reading it, unless you've got an exceptional person who's writing it, for the average person. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to get over to root, and I'm just going to quickly show you what I would do at the basic level. I'm not going to get into the special permissions right now because we don't have time to really explain them well. Maybe, I'll either send out a video, or maybe I will talk about those in the next meeting coming up. We'll see how it goes. I just have to see what else is out there next on the docket of things to talk about. All right, so ls-l on root. So what I did is I created a departments folder. And as you can see, the permissions on the department folder, it's root who owns it, right? Root owns it, and everybody can get into departments through the others with read and execute, because that's what I want them to be able to do. Because in departments, that's where I break it down to its separate departments, right? So we have the admins directory, we have the HR directory, we have the sales directory. So everybody can get to this point right here, right now. Everybody on the system who knows how to do this can get in there. What I want to do is set these up so that only the only the admins have read, write, and execute. Only HR has read, write, and execute, and only sales has read, write, and execute. The groups. Once again, depending what you want to do, you can either leave root there with read, write, execute. It basically implies that nobody else but root's going to be able to get in through the user permissions. That's what that means. If you want to get even a little fancier, you could take that nobody. Or if you have, let's say, a person in the HR group who you trust to be able to modify those permissions, then you can make them the owner of this thing. And if they, for some reason, need to modify the ownership or the permissions, once again, a little vague, on that, because you want to really make sure that person knows what they're doing about, because you'll be the one troubleshooting whatever the heck goes wrong. So what I'm going to do is we're going to focus on sales, but the same thing would happen for admins and HR. First thing I do, I want only sales to be able to, sales as the owner of this thing, right? So what's the command? Chown it, right? I want to, well actually it's change group. We're going to do change group. We could use chown, but we'll use change group. So I want the sales group to own the sales folder. Press enter. Do ls-l again in here. Oh, you know what I did? Look what I did. I told it I probably created a sales folder at the root of file system I did in the beginning, and I told you not to do that. What I did here is, and this is something you could easily make mistakes on when you're first starting out. This is the kind of stuff that will confuse you when you're first starting out. That slash at the beginning is telling me that that folder is at the root of the file system. It's not under departments, right? The one I'm wanting to change is under departments. So I've just changed permissions, or ownership I should say, but not on the right folder. So always look at the path you've written out of the thing you're trying to change, right? And you know, a lot of times you'll see me, just like I did there. I mistakenly put the slash and then put the name, forgetting that it's a subfolder, right? It's a subfolder, and actually you can see that by doing the tree command. I think it'll just show it you here, right? So underneath departments are these folders, and that's the one I want to change, not the one at the root of the file system that I made to demonstrate things. All right, so let's go back. We'll chown it again. Instead, we'll put departments, sales. Now we'll do an ls-l in here, and sure enough, now you see, this is correct, sales is now the group owner. So that means anybody who's in that sales group now has read and execute to this folder. Read and execute to a group that owns the folder is not enough. There is a way to secure it. Remember, I'm going to give them W, and I mentioned to you that W is a little scary, but look, you have to trust these people, you have to have your backups, and there are ways to prevent people from deleting something they don't own as the user account. So there are ways to get around it, but it's not perfect. So what I'm going to do now is I want to eliminate the permissions for the others. They do not need to be able to get in here. Only members of sales should ever get into the sales folder. I'm going to leave root alone because it doesn't matter, right? It doesn't matter. So I could use the numbers to do that. Here's the thing when you use numbers, and this is why I want you to be careful when you use numbers. I have to know the existing permissions that are there. So if I was for some reason to do something like 070, right? Oh, do that. Well, what that would do is it would take the permissions away from the users. So when you use numbers, you have to use all three entities' permission schemes, right? You have to put it out there. So in this case, maybe it might be better, since let's just say I'm not looking at the permissions and I just know what I need to do. So you've given me an order to say, Ed, the sales group needs write and the others need nothing. So what we would do is G plus W, comma, O equals nothing. Or, right, we could do minus. If you really want to spell it out, read, write, execute. Both of those will do the same thing against the sales folder in this underneath departments. Do an ls-l in here again. Okay, this is looking good. So we have the sales group as the group owner. We're ignoring root because root can do anything anyway, so don't worry about that. There are the permissions to the sales group. Any member of sales will have read, write, execute. They will be able to do anything they want in sales. Everybody else on the box, so people who are members of HR, won't be able to get into it. Unless they're in both groups, right? Unless they're in both groups. If they're in both groups, they'll be able to do it. The admins, you know, some of them may be able to get in, some may not, right? It doesn't matter. And what I would do is I would do the same thing to each of those folders. I would just go back, put up that, put admins there, boom, do it again, HR, because the others at this point, at this level, they all need to be able to get into departments, but they do not. After they get in there, they only should be able to go where they have permission to go. Simple. So that is at the basics, right? Where we haven't used any of the special permissions yet, which we definitely want to. They, especially on these group-owned folders, we want to apply those special permissions to it too. But we're almost at 2 o'clock, and I'm afraid I'll blow your minds with special permissions. Not that it's crazy. It's just you've already learned a lot, and it's kind of goes off in a slightly different direction on you. So I don't want to overwhelm you. What I would like you to do is just really absorb this part, right? Either work through the labs, watch the video, read the books, whatever you got to do, and really practice at the basic level right now. At the basic level, do that. But that actually is fairly decent, right? The only thing we haven't done right here, we haven't put the HR group as the owner of HR. Right now, the way we're doing it, nobody's getting into HR but root, right? So that's not going to work. And we got to do the same thing up here. So if there's an admins group, we got to add them there. If there's a HR group, we got to add them. So we might as well. Let's go do that. So I got to do a group.
Could we do that with the numbers? The HR? Could we change that with the numbers right now?
Yeah.
So that I can give an example.
Yeah. So sure we could. Let me just get the HR group in there, all right? So I'm going to do a group add HR, group add admins. This way I actually have groups I can work with. So then I'm going to chown, right? Because you always got to put the owners who need to be in there in the actual permission line.
Right.
So chown HR against HR in here. No, I don't want chown. I want change group. Sorry. I could do it. So I'll show you that it will work this way too, right? So boom, and then I'll do admins against admins.
So now you've added the HR group to the HR folder,
Correct.
and then you've added also the admins to the admins folder
Exactly.
by using that colon.
Yeah, that's because remember it's on the right-hand
Right.
side,
Yep.
right? Got it? Great. And
Totally.
like I said, if it bugs you, use the change group. It'll do exactly what you want. But let's see what
Right.
happened here. Okay, yeah, it did exactly what I wanted it to do. So now you wanted me to use the numbers to change these things.
Yep.
So based on that these are correct right now, what I'll do is I'll actually take the permissions away from root once again, just to show you, right?
But basically what we're looking at right now is it would be 770,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, you got it. That's it. It's amazing. Once you see it and you actually get it, you're like, that's not hard. That's pretty straightforward. You will have to practice. It'll all disappear
Right.
on your Caden pretty soon.
Right.
But you got it. You're understanding it, which is critical, right? That's critical. So I would do 070 against admins. What I'm doing there is I will take the permissions away from the user, which in this case is root. Once again, irrelevant. But this is a good permission scheme right here. Unless you have a user that actually needs that kind of access, then, you could put the nobody user there and give them 0 if you want to make it look nice and pretty, right? It would look nice.
But would it, so once you take it away from root will no longer be able to do anything with it, right?
Root can do anything.
Root can do it no matter what?
No matter what, yeah. Root literally is Superman, God, whatever
Right.
you want to call
Okay.
that account. It can do anything, and the system will just obey.
Okay, but essentially we change it so that nobody else can do anything to it.
Yeah, if we had another, let's say we had a user in there and they weren't working out, and I wanted to immediately just block them, I would change their permission to 0. And that would negate them. Even if they were in the group, it wouldn't matter. They wouldn't be able to get into the folder because of the way the permissions
Right.
apply.
Okay, cool, thank you.
So let's do that, and we'll do an ls-l against here again, and there it is. So this is actually the way you'll see many group folders set up. You put the user in, the group owner in there, which in this case is admins. You give them all the permissions that they need, which is everything probably, and a couple of special permissions too. And then you take everything away from everybody else. And only root, once again, we're going to forget about root because once again, root can do anything. Anybody else on the system that's not root, unless they're a member of the admins group, they're not getting into the folder. So regardless that the permissions on the directory, these are the permissions on the department directory, which is the top directory in this little structure we have going here. everybody can get in, read and execute. So any user on this box can get in there and see the admins folder, the HR folder, the sales folder. When they try to get into those folders, that's when they'll be blocked and they'll get permission denied. Make sense?
Yep.
Excellent. Excellent. All right, I'm going to pause it there. We're almost at 2 o'clock. I really don't think I could do much justice to special permissions. And I did want to talk about the UMass too. I think we'll bring it up in the next. I'll do a little review of this, and then we'll bring it up and I'll give you guys how you would then use the UMask to help you, right? To do this and not have to think about it. Because the one account that you want to change the UMask for by default, in my opinion, I think a lot of admins' opinion, is the root account. So you change it so that when root creates a folder or a file, the only entity that gets permissions is the root user. Everybody else gets 0. And you can do that through the UMask. So it doesn't matter what the permissions are when they start out. The UMask is applied, it subtracts the permissions, and then that's the default. So once again, I don't want to get into it too deep right now. I think it might get a little confusing based on everything. If you could just apply yourselves to what we've talked about over the next day or so, practice with it a little bit, go through the labs maybe one more time if you want to look at the flashcards. But that way when we come back on Thursday and I present UMask and special permissions, you'll be in better shape for it. All right. I think we're going to stop there, guys. Like I said, either I'll send out videos. I have videos on these topics already. I'll send them out. But maybe we'll do a quick review on Thursday when we get together, just to show you how you put it all together, right? All the things that they're talking about in Chapter 7 and Chapter 6, you put them all together to create this secure group folder that people in that group can share. All right, any questions before we take off, gentlemen?
I just have one. Sorry, I know.
Yeah. No, this is good.
I noticed in the modules tab in Canvas, there hasn't been anything unlocked. I don't know if that was intentional or if it's just on my end. Just double checking.
Yeah, no, it's my fault. I thought I had unlocked them. I was just telling Keenan this earlier.
Okay.
I will, after I get off, I'm going to grab something to drink, and then I'll come back and go through. At least I'll get some of them open today, and then I'll probably finish off the rest of them tomorrow.
No worries, man. No rush.
Okay. All
Thank
right.
you.
You're welcome. Everybody did great. You did great. This is a tough subject for a lot of people. They get overwhelmed with all the little pieces they have to put together, and you guys did great. So, bravo. All right, gentlemen, thank you for attending today. Really, I appreciate it. And I'll see you all on Thursday, and we'll continue and talk about something else cool.
Perfect.
All
Have
right.
a good one. Thank you.
Happy Valentine's Day, everybody.
Yeah.
Hey,
Well,
you too.
happy Valentine's.